I'm William S. Tribell. I'm a poet. I've been published in journals, anthologies, magazines around the world. And I do a lot of audiovisual work with voice actors and the like.
Why are you a poet?
I don't know. I guess I've always been a poet, really. I mean, I think everybody is a poet, and I've done a lot of things musically, and eventually I came to back to poetry, if you will. I came full circle. Instead of complicating it, I took it back to the root, and for me, that's poetry.
How long have you been pursuing poetry?
Well, I think I've been into poetry, and as I said, I've written, everybody's a poet, I think. We've all written poetry at some time in our life or another, and as I grew up in my childhood and everything, I was into poetry, writing poetry, and then it branched to other things. I pursued music for a long period of time, and then I'd say, but to answer the question, I'd say pursuing poetry probably 5-6 years, and for me, poetry is the root.
What are your influences, mentors, teachers?
Well, for me, those aren't the I don't think these will be standard answers. I don't really think I'm truly influenced a lot by poets, and if I am, they are not of this era, not my contemporaries, if you will. I'm into the beats, or I was growing up. I found the beat poets, but more so, I would say people like Bob Dylan, Neil Young, musicians who wrote very poetically.
When were you first exposed to poetry, and the first poet that you ever read?
Well, in my childhood, I was exposed to poetry, and I enjoyed poetry as a child or as a young adult too. I wrote a lot. I would say my first exposure to a poet would be Shakespeare, Marlowe, Lord Byron, the classics.
Has your work appeared in any anthologies, journals, magazines, etc.?
I've been in quite a few journals, magazines, anthologies. I haven't yet produced a book, but I come out in magazines and anthologies yearly.
Any chapbooks, poetry collections?
No, as I touched upon, I've not put out a book, and I'd say the reason why is the pursuit. I get a little overwhelmed by it and knowing where to take it, what to do with it. I have a few manuscripts together, and I do plan to put something out.
What are some other ways you get your work out there?
I do a lot of audiovisual work. I had an idea a few years ago that maybe people don't read like they used to, especially the youth of today. They're not really reading as they used to, and I mean, you know, books are now on our Kindles and on our iPads and things like that, and so I thought a good way to reach more people, or at least different people than I would in the printed word, was through audiovisual. So I've made a lot of videos using actors, voice actors, and people with great voices, and obviously making small films to the poems. I've worked with Gary Burbank, Radio Hall of Famer Gary Burbank, John Barrymore, and many others, in hopes that I would reach a broader audience with poetry.
If when you do readings, is there a specific poem that you read, or is your set list based on what you're feeling, crowd's favorite poem?
I guess yes and no. If I have something that has been out recently in an anthology or a magazine, or it has reached an audience and gotten some review, I might lead with that a lot in readings at the time, but it's subject to change at any given time.
Okay, let's define poetry. What is poetry to you?
Poetry to me is the root. It is, I think most things come back to poetry. Even when I see visual art, there's something about it that's poetic to me. So again, I found it that I was returning to the most base element of my creative ability was to focus on poetry. Like I was saying about music, music is poetry to me. And, you know, a song is written a certain way. There's a formula. Even philosophy, I think, at root is poetic. I think poetry is the root.
Is poetry important?
I think poetry is very important. I think poetry is evident in everything that we ever do, and the importance is reflected in that, and that we have there's a danger of us becoming shallow as a culture, as a people, as a group, without poetry.
It is said that poetry now is dead. Do you believe that?
I don't think it's dead. I don't think poetry is dead. I think poetry, if anything, is on its deathbed or its sick bed. But I don't think it's dead. I mean, I see all kinds of poets. I write poetry. Others write poetry. So it is still alive. Maybe it's gasping for air, but it's alive.
Why do you think there's a negative attitude towards poetry?
I think there's a negative attitude. I think there is a negative attitude toward poetry because it is the root, as I said, and everybody does it. At some time in our lives, all people write poetry, and I think it gets mistreated, if you will. Like people have a tendency to want poetry to be a stepping stone to a higher art instead of seeing it as a high art.
It's no secret that poetry is no longer part of the mainstream market. Why do you think poetry is out of the limelight?
Again, I think it is out of the limelight for those same reasons. Poetry is, everybody writes poetry, and to say what is good and bad is in poetry, a good poet, good poetry, bad poetry. This is subjective and relative. So, yeah, I think it's out of the limelight because all humans can do it, and it gets judged as being a stepping stone art.
Do you think publishers have an effect on societal views of poetry, and are they a possible influence towards the death of poetry?
Yes, I do, but I think this is maybe one of those things like when reality imitates art, and then art imitates reality, and so on and so forth, like back and forth. And that, again, this is because of if a publisher is putting out poetry and they're not selling it, and they know that if they put out a novel or a collection of short stories and they're guaranteed at least a margin of sales higher than what they do with poetry, of course they're going to put out less poetry, and this in essence creates that back and forth of customized realities.
Poetry is left to mostly small presses and self-publishing. Chapbooks are especially popular in that respect. What are your thoughts on self-publishing?
I think it's a great thing, but at the same time, from the poet's point of view, I think it can be a slippery slope because of the things we've spoke about earlier. Poetry, again, all people write poetry and can write poetry, and whether poetry is good or bad is subjective and in the eye of the beholder, if you will. So to self-produce without any before credential, if in that field, you might marginalize yourself or create a stigma. There's a stigma that's there where people might not take you seriously by self-producing.
The internet has made a lot of things easier, more accessible, especially for writers with access to blogs and free online postings. social media, art, website, etc. Does this hinder poetry or does it help? Do you think that easy access has made an impression on the nature of poetry?
Yes. First of all, I think it is a good thing that it is available to everybody. People can get their poetry out there. People that are just starting out and not knowing what to do, because the poet is left in a weird place. If you start looking online trying to figure out how to be a poet and how to get published, one of the first things you come across is poets don't need agents. They'll tell you you're supposed to, the poet is supposed to know and do all these things themselves. So in that, the fact that a poet can put their poetry online and get it seen, and if people do like it, they've reached a lot of people, and it might open up doors for them that they didn't know were available. At the same time, I think it might be slightly detrimental for the same reasons. It projects that idea that poetry is a lesser art. It might produce the idea that poetry is a lesser art. Where poets, like you find this in music a lot of time, like people that are unaffiliated to music, they think music, like, well, why don't you play this gig because it'll be good exposure to you and there's no money in it, right? Or the old adage, like, there's poets that are just waiting for their novels to be produced. And I think this might, at the same time as being a good thing, it could make that more prevalent. I think it's a good and a bad thing that the poet has the ability to get his work out there, and in this time that poetry is being marginalized and is seeming to die, at least there is a medium out there that's readily accessible to the average poet or the person who's just entering into poetry. And some of the online publications get more views and have a bigger following than some of the print. And obviously I think maybe that's the future anyway, is digital and online productions.
In quotation, America is behind the gap in the poetry world, end quotation. From your experience, is that a good statement to make?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I spent 5 years in Eastern Europe, and I'm only recently back in America. And I noticed it when I left, and of course I noticed it on my return. Other countries still embrace poetry for what it is. They still see it as the important art that it is, the important expression of the human soul and point of view, and how we, I think I said earlier, I think poetry and philosophy are kindred. I think they're related very closely, and our depth of knowledge and how we perceive is rooted in poetry. And there is a bubblegum element to the American culture as of late that isn't prevalent in other countries that still embrace poetry more fully and respectfully.
Poetry has had some historical moments. Do you think there is an event or period of time in the last few years where poetry has had a defining moment?
I have to say I don't think so. I mean, I think any poet or I know or that has the opportunity to make that occur. And I think that all of us should think of that it is an important thing. But no, I really don't. I mean, I guess maybe I'm wrong, it's my opinion, but I really can't think of anything that has really done that, except for perhaps if you want to include rap music or any kind of music for that matter, because in a sense, in the Western world, that is where our poets have gone.
At one time, poets were viewed as prophets. Do you think there's an inspiring, living poet today, a poet that would make audiences listen?
Well, living, of course, and I have to say Bob Dylan. As far as someone who is accepted as poet, like, we accept Bob Dylan as a musician. I contend he's a poet who makes music. But again, I think we're in a time, and this applies to that concept of poetry being dead or on its deathbed, if you will, is the fact that we don't have that. We don't have if you look at past generations, the beats and these movements that would occur, that even people outside of the field, if you will, people that aren't really into poetry, will know who those people are. And with the passing of Maya Angelou, I cannot think of anybody that's had a world-shaking impact coming from strictly the poetic, from the poetic.
It has been said that poets are talking to each other too much, that there is not much interaction with the general public, and we're mostly focused on each other. Is that a fair statement to make?
I believe it is. I do a lot of readings when I look out into the audience, and all I see are my fellow readers. And but I think that this happened naturally because of the poetry being marginalized in the arts, and the audiences technically, I don't want to say not being there, but being in they too being marginalized. I think that creates this. And yeah, so I do believe that we do tend to aim ourselves at each other more than we should, instead of maybe aiming at the populace who isn't looking at poetry right now. Maybe those are the ones that we should be trying to bring back into the fold, as it were.
There's an article that said you can tell a medium is still vital by posing the question, can it change anything? Can poetry change anything?
Absolutely, and I think there are examples recently enough that show this out in the world. There was a young poet in an Arabic-speaking country who was condemned to death, I believe, not a year or so ago, not so long ago, and I think that shows, of course, poetry can. Poetry, in the same way, music. Again, I'll bring up music because they are kindred. I believe they're related. They're brother and sister, if you will. I think poetry can influence point of view, can influence thought, and I think it always has. And maybe in our Western context, it's not so much anymore because it seems like poetry is misplaced and again marginalized. Or it is rearing itself in other places, as in music, because a good songwriter, to me, is a poet. But if you do look at other countries where poetry is still viable and at the forefront, it happens all the time that somebody doing something poetic affects culture in a good or bad way.
Let's talk events. Are there specific events that help generate interest in poetry? And is it enough, or do we need to be more proactive about gaining awareness?
I can think of, what is it, 1,000 Poets for Change. I think they're pretty noted. But no, I think there's always room for us to do more. And if you're living in a community that doesn't have a poetry reading, I think it would be a great thing to create one and allow people that aren't maybe professional poets the chance to have their work heard, because I truly believe that we are all poets and that we all should express that. And I don't think it's something that people grow out of. They might put it away. You know, like that old adage about the when I was an adult I put away my toys, or however that goes. I don't think people should put away poetry, and I think it still exists in all people. And I would think if there is room, and we all should try to produce more genres, more movements, if you will, for poetry to grow and envelop and reach out to our fellow people, not just the ones we consider poets, but everyone.
If we need more awareness, how should we as poets go about getting it?
That's a very deep question. Pay attention, look around you. That would be my answer, is to just pay attention to the world around you and try to be aware. Be openly mindful of needing to be aware would be my answer to that question.
As a poet, do you feel we should have more awareness? Like, should we be as big as the modern literature, like Twilight books and the 50 Shades of Grey books and so on?
Well, maybe, sure, but I think that comes with like we've discussed earlier. I think that comes with said movement of poetry existing, and it's the same as like I don't think that there are poets existing right now in the Western context that do have any kind of really large effect on the populace. Like after Maya Angelou's passing, I can't think of any others that do it on a pop culture level. And I believe that if a poet does rise up to a pop culture level, you would see poetry again reaching the populace's awareness as the 50 Shades of Grey or Twilight does.
As a poet, what is your message to young writers and young poets? Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, well, be yourself. Don't let the mass opinion sway you, and write from your heart. It might seem cliche, but I don't know how else to say it. But write what you feel, and always follow what you feel without being influenced unduly by mass opinion. This is a piece I've written recently. It's called Moonlit Flit. In the shadow, just left of the light, from the moon, signs from on high. Yeah, looking at the sky. And I'm not dreaming all of the time, and scheming only part of the way. And every morning the sun breaks the silence. Indeed, the shadows hold the past. And maybe, as I'm on my way, uninsured, past broken doorknobs to the pavement, under the windowsills, potted plants and reality TV, through the hills to the ghetto man. My Uncle Sam says, it's all fine, it's taking my time. Time, American dreams, southern comforts, prairie winds, desert, deserted haze, all the way to London town, all the way to anywhere, or southern France, speaking eyes face to face, no room for quotations, and smiling. Yeah, all the way around and back. Maybe windows and doors. When it rains, the colors pale and moody. Dreary day or night, the same world you see. In the making, waking mind, windows, doors, thinking, before the rest catch on, and I'm gone.